Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. Today's presentation, Preventing Avian Influenza Introductions, focus on the big risks, is part of the USDA's Defend the Flock campaign, promoting awareness about the importance of biosecurity and ways to prevent the spread of infectious poultry diseases. We're here today to support you and your flocks with expanded biosecurity resources. I'm Dr. Julie Gauthier with the USDA, and today I'm joined by Dr. Tim Boyer, a biological scientist with the Center for Epidemiology and Animal Health in the USDA APHIS, and Dr. Carol Cardona, the Pomeroy Chair in Avian Health for the College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Minnesota. I'll give you a few housekeeping items before we get started. First, we want to let you know that real-time streaming captions are available for this program. To view the captions, type the caption URL that you see on this slide, bit.ly/APHIS_fall21web_CC. Type that into your browser. The URL appears at the bottom of every slide, so you can link to captions at any time during the program. Please note that the URL is case sensitive. To submit questions, click the Q&A button. Also, it's located at the bottom of the screen. APHIS and our guests will answer all your questions after the webinar has concluded. The Q&A will be posted along with a recording of this webinar on the APHIS website. Be sure to follow the Defend the Flock campaign on Facebook and on Twitter to find out when the Q&A and the recording are available. We'll share those online destinations at the end of the webinar. Now we'll take a few minutes to introduce ourselves. I'm Julie Gauthier, and I'm the Assistant Director for Poultry Health with USDA APHIS Veterinary Services. I'm a veterinary epidemiologist by training, and I have operated a small family farm raising heritage breed poultry. In my USDA role, I lead subject matter experts who coordinate the National Poultry Improvement Plan, the Live Bird Marketing System Working Group, and National Avian Disease Response Strategy and Policy. Dr. Boyer, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. So I am a biological scientist at the USDA APHIS Center for Epidemiology and Animal Health on the Transboundary Disease Analytics team. And in my role there, I've worked on epidemiologic investigations of avian influenza and virulent Newcastle disease, among others, to identify risk factors for introduction and spread of those diseases. I also create disease spread computer simulations of outbreaks in livestock in order to study the epidemiologic behavior of those diseases and to evaluate control measures and to support animal emergency preparedness activities. I received a Master of Public Health and a PhD from the University of Minnesota in Environmental Infectious Diseases from the School of Public Health there. So I'm not a veterinarian, but I've been working in animal health and infectious diseases for roughly 15 years.
Thanks, Dr. Boyer. Dr. Cardona, please tell us about yourself.
Hi, I'm Carol Cardona, and I'm at the University of Minnesota, where I hold the B.S. Pomeroy Chair in Avian Health. I'm part of the Secure Food Systems team, which is the risk analysis team that is part of the secure supply plans. I got my veterinary degree from Purdue University, and I got my PhD from Michigan State University. I did a residency in poultry medicine at the University of California at Davis, my home state. And then I am a diplomate of the American College of Poultry Veterinarians. I've worked in with avian influenza viruses for most of my career, and I enjoy working with collaboratively with producers to help them create cooperative disease control plans.
Thank you, Dr. Cardona. Talking to people about poultry biosecurity is a significant part of my job, as it is for my guests as well. I thought about the term biosecurity the other day, and I realized that I really take it for granted, both its meaning and how the concept started. It's a term that today I see it used to refer to actions to protect any living things, not just poultry, but also organizations developing biosecurity plans for other farmed animals use the term, developing plans for people, plants, water ecosystems, or even entire nations. But I suspect the poultry industry invented and used that word first. And I think it was right around the time of that devastating, highly pathogenic avian influenza outbreak in Pennsylvania in the 1980s. So I looked into it. I investigated the history of biosecurity a little bit. And the first publication that I was able to find was about a cost-benefit analysis for management options for broiler breeder farms. And that was in the late 1980s. Tim, what do you know about the origin of the term biosecurity? When did agricultural producers start using that word and why?
Well, it's hard to nail down exactly when agricultural producers started to use that specific word, biosecurity. Many of the principles and measures that make up biosecurity are old and have evolved over time as our understanding of disease risk has changed. But a historical record that I found helpful when thinking about this was the proceedings of the U.S. Animal Health Association annual meetings. They've posted all of them on their website going back to 1910. And you can see how the thinking about what they called sanitation and hygiene changed over time. But the first time I saw the term biosecurity used in those documents was in 1981. And it was a recommendation to create educational programs directed toward turkey growers to inform them about the risks of low-path avian influenza in their flocks without adequate biosecurity. So on this big 600-page document covering a wide variety of animal health topics and species, biosecurity was only mentioned in the context of poultry. So I think you're right about the poultry industry being an early adopter of that term. The next time I saw it show up was in 1984, and there the word appears many times. All of them are related to one event that you just mentioned, the highly pathogenic avian influenza outbreak in Pennsylvania. And that really seemed to be a watershed moment for biosecurity. That year, there was discussion about how biosecurity practices used at the time weren't sufficient to prevent the spread of HPAI. And once the response really ramped up and there were major efforts to educate and step up biosecurity during the response, that seemed to be helpful in controlling the spread. And then there was also a recommendation that moving forward from that outbreak, each state should activate and maintain a sustainable state industry task force that's concerned with poultry biosecurity against avian influenza and other infectious diseases. So after that year, the term shows up frequently in the context of other species, but yeah, it seems like 1984 was the watershed moment for biosecurity.
It's an interesting history. And Carol, what are your thoughts about the origin of the concept of biosecurity?
Well, I don't have a lot to add to that, but I do know my older veterinary friends do sort of circle around the idea that it was a made-up term, that its origins, it did originate with the poultry industry or with USDA APHIS in their work with poultry industry, and but it was just a word that came out of that was completely constructed. And I think the first time I was exposed to the concept of biosecurity was when I did my residency at the Turlock Lab in California, and we watched videos about how how to apply biosecurity to poultry farms, and it was that were created by USDA APHIS after the 1984 outbreak in Pennsylvania. That was the first time I personally was introduced to the terms. Although I'd gone through veterinary school, we really didn't talk about biosecurity at that time.
I'd like to track down those old videos and take a look at those again. Tim, what's your definition for biosecurity? How do you define it?
Well, for me, I mean, it's a broad term that covers a wide range of operations or structural measures, procedures that are intended to protect animals against disease and reduce the risk of introduction and spread of disease agents. It's about risk and requires a risk assessment that's unique to each production facility and planning and implementation to reduce those risks.
And Carol, what's your definition?
Well, I think of biosecurity slightly differently. I think about what it does. I think it's really the only, I define it as the only sustainable way to economically produce poultry. And I would add to that, maybe ethically produce poultry, because biosecurity is the only way we have for many diseases to protect birds from disease agents. And also that's the only way to maintain their health, but it's also the only way to maintain their well-being. So, I think about it as biosecurity is something that gives us something that we can't do another way.
And let's dive into the details of those principles of biosecurity and move on to the next slide. The National Poultry Improvement Plan developed the 14 biosecurity principles in 2016. And since last year, larger poultry producers must have a biosecurity plan in place that includes each of these principles in order for them to be eligible for USDA indemnity in the event of a highly pathogenic avian influenza outbreak. Tim, how did NPIP arrive at these 14 biosecurity principles, and why are they considered the minimum measures that all poultry farms should follow?
Well, I think after the 2015 outbreak, there was recognition that effective biosecurity to prevent avian influenza was a gap. And also there was a need to give government entities better insight into what producers were doing to protect themselves for the purposes of indemnity. So I think the first step to address that was an effort by the University of Minnesota and Iowa State University and the USDA, maybe others too who I'm leaving out, who developed a biosecurity checklist that I think was based on expert opinion and epidemiologic evidence, experience with past outbreaks. And that checklist was reviewed and revised by industry and states. And then the NPIP adopted those items and further fleshed them out, added an auditing component to it, and those became the 14 biosecurity principles. The reason they're considered minimum measures is that they really describe the elements and categories of information that are needed to have a successful biosecurity program, but they don't provide the specifics for each one. An analogy that I thought was helpful are recipes for cooking. All recipes have minimum requirements to be successful. They need a list of ingredients, they need the quantities of each ingredient, they need a list of required equipment, and they need to tell you what to do with all those ingredients and in what order and for how long. And every recipe needs those things, but the specific elements and the level of detail required are going to be different for baking a cake from scratch versus making toast. And it's the same for biosecurity programs. All of them need to follow those 14 principles, but the specifics of what is included and how it's implemented are going to vary according to what is appropriate for a particular site or production system. For example, the fifth principle addresses personnel, and it says to describe procedures and biosecurity and personal protective equipment required for site-dedicated personnel and for non-farm personnel. And also procedures for personnel who have had recent contact with other poultry or avian species. So for personal protective equipment, that might mean farm-specific clothing and boots. It might mean building-specific clothing and boots. It might mean disposable boots, gloves, masks, maybe a Danish entry system. Those 14 principles, they don't tell you what you have to include among those things. That's up to you to determine what's appropriate for your system based on your evaluation of risk.
I like your analogy, Tim. It's making me a little hungry. Carol, from your perspective, how did the 14 principles come to be?
Well, none of these principles are really new with this particular part of NPIP. Many of them are included in other programs like the Salmonella program or the Mycoplasma program because these principles are well established. But my perspective, I completely agree with Tim on this as to where they actually arose, how they actually arose. But I think when I look at them, I think that they really represent parts of pathways. So if we look at, for example, in avian influenza, we might say, well, wild birds would be the reservoir hosts or a good source of avian influenza virus. So we can see that, we have this number 6 is a listing of wild birds and something that we should have a wild bird control program or exclusion program. Then, wild birds would the pathway might be that they could contaminate, come to your farm and eat spilled feed in your perimeter buffer area that would be next to the barn, for example. And so you can see that perimeter buffer area control is part of the is also part of one of the principles, number 4. And then you can see that someone would have to walk through that contamination, fecal material from wild birds on the ground, and walk into the barn in order to expose your turkeys or chickens. And so you can see the line of separation is also a principle, number 3. So these principles to me represent the various component parts of pathways for how avian influenza or other pathogens might make their way onto a farm and into a barn and thus expose the birds. And so if any one of these is mitigated, you reduce your chances of being exposed. And if all of those component parts are addressed, you reduce your risk of infection even more.
These principles seem to be good common sense, but how do we know they work to prevent spread of avian influenza from farm to farm? Tim, what's the evidence?
There's been a lot of work and research providing evidence of the effectiveness of biosecurity. There's a number of epidemiologic studies that have associated avian influenza infection with risk factors related to biosecurity or a lack of biosecurity. It's difficult to quantify the effectiveness of biosecurity measures. I was looking at one interesting study recently that looked at the seroprevalence of respiratory diseases in small flocks in California, and it found that a pretty high prevalence, but some biosecurity measures like dedicated footwear and sourcing birds from hatcheries that are in compliance with NPIP were associated with lower seroprevalence of some of the pathogens. So that's just one example of evidence that biosecurity can reduce the risk.
Good example. And Carol, what evidence do you have that demonstrates that these principles work?
Well, I would go to, I think the risk assessments and the Secure Poultry Supply Plan give you a lot of good evidence. In fact, hundreds of pages and hundreds of references of evidence. But in addition to that, we use those citations. We add to that expert interviews. We work with the industry to talk to them about their experiences with biosecurity. Then we use those mitigation measures and we model what the outcomes might be in disease transmission. And we see that the flow or the exposure, the movement of infection, the transmission of infection of avian influenza can be stopped by the implementation of specific types of mitigations, because as I said before, it interrupts a pathway. And then we write a guidance about that, and you can, and then because we've written those guidances, the industry in outbreaks has put those into use and in cooperation with their state permitting authorities. And so we know that they work because we have seen that product and animals can be moved from not known to be infected premises using this guidance because those principles work.
Thanks. Let's move on to the next slide and talk about how the biosecurity principles, although they were developed with avian influenza prevention in mind, it covers more than just avian influenza. There are other, maybe more common infectious diseases that cause serious problems for poultry, such as infectious bronchitis that causes the soft-shelled eggs that you see in the image at the top, or infectious laryngotracheitis causing the discharge or respiratory distress in the center image, or Newcastle disease, which could cause the nervous system signs that you see in the image at the bottom. And I should point out that avian influenza can cause egg anomalies, respiratory signs, and nervous system signs, a lot like the photos that you see. And it's not possible to determine the cause of illness without laboratory tests. And Tim, I'll ask you, how well do the principles apply to preventing other poultry diseases besides avian influenza?
Yeah, well, the principles are designed for keeping pathogens out in general, not just avian influenza. That just happens to be a pretty challenging pathogen. But for example, having measures in place to establish a perimeter buffer area, having procedures for vehicles and people entering the perimeter buffer area, that should help reduce the risk of avian influenza and other pathogens that persist in the environment and can be spread by fomites. Another is sourcing birds from flocks that are monitored for poultry pathogens according to NPIP guidelines. That will reduce the risk of introducing a number of pathogens through that particular pathway.
So the biosecurity principles are clearly not just for avian influenza. And in what ways does biosecurity contribute to raising healthy poultry generally, Carol?
Well, there's some other good examples, I think, that you have to think about. You know, obviously, avian influenza is not the only concern, as you've pointed out. Salmonella is, of course, a big food safety concern and can also be a major poultry pathogen. And we know that avian influenza has reservoir hosts in wild aquatic birds, while salmonella has reservoirs in that are rodents. So part of what biosecurity can do is prevent salmonella infections in poultry by if we address the rodent population. So rodent control is one of the things that is part of the NPIP biosecurity plans. In addition, getting your poultry from known sources is another biosecurity principle that helps to prevent the vertical transmission of salmonella to poults, or to poults or chicks. In addition, I just want to point out that, you know, biosecurity not only helps to limit the spread of the things we can't see, it also can limit the spread of things that we can see. And so many of our listeners are probably well familiar with the fact, you know, that people tend to build houses next to poultry farms, or might build houses or live near places where people have small poultry flocks, and dogs, cats, all kinds of wandering people can also come onto a poultry farm and cause damage. Dogs in particular can prey on chicken flocks and cause a lot of damage. So biosecurity is not just for the things you can't see, but also for the things you can.
That's an excellent point. Predation is a big problem for a lot of small flocks. And on the next slide, we'll talk about how the biosecurity plan is meant to be site-specific, and it takes into consideration the physical layout of the farm and how it's managed. There are so many options for biosecurity measures. These can vary greatly in cost and their difficulty in implementing them. So among all those options, how should a producer decide which measures to put in place on a particular farm? And what should a producer focus on? Tim, can you talk about how a producer can choose from the menu of options?
Well, like you said, it depends on the specifics of the farm characteristics. What might be right for one farm might not be for another. The whole point of creating a biosecurity plan is to evaluate and manage risk. And these 14 principles are methods for reducing the risk. So I guess I'd start by thinking about what's my biggest concern. What am I doing now for biosecurity? How do my current practices fit into these 14 principles? And how is my current biosecurity mitigating the risks of this biggest concern? Can I identify any gaps? Can I identify any reasonable measures that would be acceptable to me and my workers that are sustainable, that could help close those gaps? For example, are the PPE requirements and procedures for my site that are dedicated to my workers, are they adequate? How about for non-farm personnel? Are there changes I can make to those requirements that would reduce my risk of introducing disease onto my farm? The nice thing about these 14 principles is that they allow you to tackle things in bite-sized pieces. so that you don't get overwhelmed when thinking about all the ways that disease could enter your farm.
Carol, what is your advice about selecting appropriate measures?
Well, I like all the things that Tim said, and I completely agree. I think, acceptable to workers and feasible are really, really critical. And I just want to point out the picture here is something that, we've often thought, or we've in the past supported this kind of boot dip approach. So this is an iodine foot bath, and iodine requires about at least 30 seconds to kill about 80% of the viruses and bacteria that you might step into, might have on your boots and not want to track into your poultry house. Well, 80% isn't good enough for most people. And so you really have to stand in that iodine foot bath for a good minute, if not more. If you think that's, sort of simple and easy, just try standing in a bucket of water and see how well your mind doesn't wander, and, you don't think about other things, and you don't wish like heck you could get out of that bucket. It's not, and it's not a particularly good barrier. So I just want to point that out. And I think most of our poultry industry has gone away from using this as a sole barrier for footwear. And so you hear people talking about changing boots or using barn specific boots, which is a much more feasible and much more acceptable way to introduce workers to line of separation strategies.
That gets me thinking about what other biosecurity measures might seem to make a lot of sense, like a foot bath, but haven't really turned out to be worth it. Tim, can you think of any examples of biosecurity measures that just might not be worth it?
Well, the main one that comes to mind for me is the one that Carol just discussed, and that's foot baths. Along with the soaking time required, the solution you use needs to be fresh and changed frequently. And there should be no organic material on your boots for it to be able to do its job. And so if you're not going to do those things consistently, then that measure might not be worth it, and it could even do more harm than good. And so the measures that aren't worth it are really just the ones that you're not going to do, or you're not going to do correctly.
Good points. And Carol, would you like to add to that discussion of other items that might not be worth introducing to your plan?
Yeah, I guess one of mine is signs. A lot of times we put up a sign outside of the farm to say stop, don't enter, and very, very often they're in English, and whereas the most likely person to enter your farm might be Spanish speaking or might speak some other language. So it's important to have your signs in probably multiple languages. In addition, I really frankly don't read signs very well if I go through the same door every day. So I think it's important to kind of change those up. If you really want people to pay attention, you've got to think about moving the signs, changing their shape, adding color, whatever it is, so when things are, that's something that you potentially could do if you're in a dangerous time. Really think about freshening up your signs and making them surprising to the people who see them every day, and get workers and visitors and everybody else engaged.
Good tips. On the next slide, let's move on to talking about risk factors for introducing avian influenza to a poultry farm. And you provided this chart, Carol, and I found it very helpful to illustrate the importance of the different categories of biosecurity measures. Could you describe the chart and tell me what does the size of the pie pieces indicate?
So this chart is derived from a risk assessment, and actually it summarizes multiple risk assessments, and it's the mitigation measures that provide the greatest impact on transmission. So we're turning our risk assessment inside out and making it into a biosecurity weighted chart. So the size of the pie indicates the amount of impact that measure had on preventing the transmission of infection. So, for example, if we look at the strict line of separation enforcement with PPE, that had that was I think 22% impact on, or no, sorry, 15% impact on our on the spread of infection, whereas feed truck restrictions had less than 5% impact on the transmission of avian influenza.
And Tim, could you comment about how well these categories align with the risk factors you identified in your research? And can you describe how some of these categories are related or might overlap?
Yeah, well, many of these categories have been identified as risk factors in the epidemiologic work that we've done here over the past several years. There's some overlap between those different outbreaks, but they also each identified risk factors unique to each situation, and that reflects that risk is context specific. It can vary according to the type of production system, the part of the country where the farms are located, the virus strain. But a lot of risk factors identified in those studies, they fall under perimeter buffer area enforcement, since that is the first line of defense. Multiple studies have identified vehicles or personnel coming close to the barns that haven't followed biosecure entry procedures. Factors related to strict line separation have been identified. Things like having a hard surface entry pad that is clean and disinfected has been found to be protective. An expert elicitation study identified barn enclosure defects as a risk factor, which also falls under that category. And that study also identified shared equipment and vehicles. Inadequate visitor restrictions or procedures have been identified. Downtime for employees, bird-proof confinement have come up in some studies, and biosecured dead bird disposal has been identified multiple times, as has biosecured garbage management. Some of these things come up repeatedly, and it relates to where the virus is on the farm. It's in infected birds, it's in dead birds, and some of these things that come up repeatedly are related to business operations that have to happen and can't go away completely. You can't keep everyone out of the barn, but you can do things to mitigate these factors and reduce the risk of disease coming onto your farm. And these categories are not all independent of each other. Biosecured dead bird disposal, vehicle clean and disinfection, truck and driver biosecurity, visitor restrictions, they all fall under strict perimeter buffer area enforcement. Bird-proof confinement, showering and changing clothes, those fall under strict line of separation enforcement with PPE. So if you really have strong perimeter buffer area enforcement, entry is limited to clearly identified access points, marked with signs. Non-essential vehicles aren't entering the perimeter buffer area. Employees, visitors, truck drivers, service personnel are trained and understand the procedures to follow when entering that area. You're really addressing multiple risk categories.
So let's dig in a bit more into your research, Tim, and talk about what did we learn from the largest U.S. outbreak of high-path avian influenza back in 2015. And tell us about the differences between the farms that became infected and those that didn't.
Well, during that outbreak, APHIS conducted what they call a case control study during that outbreak, where they interviewed participants from infected egg-laying premises and from non-infected egg-laying premises and that were in the same geographic area. They asked many questions related to premises characteristics, farm and barn infrastructure, environmental factors like wildlife, things related to service personnel and vehicle and equipment, other barn level and farm level biosecurity procedures. And what they found was that rendering trucks and garbage trucks coming near barns and company service personnel visiting in the previous 14 days were risk factors for disease spread. Having visitors change clothes was protective, and that may be an indicator of just generally heightened attention to human-caused risk pathways, because the farms that required a change of clothing also were more likely to require other visitor-related action. The most important risk factor was being located within 10 kilometers of an infected premises in that study. And that really gets to the heightened risk when HPI is known to be in the area and the need to be especially diligent about biosecurity in those situations. So those were the biggest ones that showed up in the final statistical analysis, but there were a lot of other interesting results in that study that described differences in biosecurity practices between the case and the control farms. And those can help inform biosecurity planning. For example, a much higher percentage of cold control farms had hard surface entry pads that were cleaned and disinfected than case farms. And one counterintuitive result that was in there was that a higher percentage, more than twice as many of the case farms than control farms. Sometimes weird results like that lead to new insights. So, was it something related to the shower facilities, not the size and scale of those operations, or was it a compliance issue? But, showering in your biosecurity plan, it's one thing, but actually doing it is another.
That's an excellent point. Carol, what do you consider to be the important lessons that we learned from studying the 2015 outbreak?
Well, I think it's important to remember that this was about the 2015 outbreak. So, I guess I would ask Tim about why, how this might, if he thinks this would apply to the next outbreak, that we don't even know when or where that would happen. So do you think it would?
Well, I think it's the reason why we keep doing epidemiologic investigations every time there's a high-path avian influenza outbreak is because sometimes, the situations can be different with every outbreak and every virus, and we do see overlap. We do see some risk factors that come up repeatedly, and others tend to be unique to particular outbreaks. So some of these things we saw in this case control study from 2015 maybe wouldn't be totally relevant in the next outbreak. This case control study took place only in egg-laying operations, so would it apply to other production types, and would it apply for outbreaks that happen in other parts of the country? I think there are some messages in there that are pretty fundamental and would apply generally, and other things that maybe wouldn't.
So on the next slide, I pulled out a few other pie pieces because this was striking to me. These 4 measures on the right-hand side of the pie, they can control, if you deal with these, you can control nearly half of the risk to the flock. Carol, what is your message to producers about that right half of this pie?
Well, I think you're exactly right, Julie. I think the importance of these 4 measures are that they really do represent sort of the first line of defense, the perimeter buffer area, and the last line of defense, the strict line of separation enforcement. And those two, along with the other 4, these 4 criteria are also controlled by the producer at the local level, by the farmer, the rancher, that every the person who's on the farm can control these things. These are not things that come from, outside of his control. So wild birds, rodents, these are all things that he can control, and therefore can some of our best defenses against disease.
Tim, will you comment about the importance of addressing these 4 areas of concern?
Well, the perimeter buffer area is the first line of defense, and the line of separation is the last line of defense. And we've already talked about how they can overlap and include a lot of other risk factors. So they are very important. Visitors can potentially be a vulnerability if they don't understand or follow biosecurity procedures, and equipment can serve as a means of disease spread. And you should have measures in place to restrict sharing as much as possible and to have proper cleaning and disinfection procedures for equipment.
And on the next slide, we've been talking mostly about everyday biosecurity. So let's turn the conversation to riskier times and places. The risk of avian influenza introduction increases at times when wild migratory birds carrying influenza congregate near poultry farms. The risk of spread is very high when a farm that shares services with other farms is infected. I'll ask you first, Carol, what is the difference between biosecurity in peacetime when no detections have been made or outbreaks or outbreaks are nearby, and then biosecurity in the middle of an infected zone?
Well, the difference is the amount of virus that's out there. So if you think about normal times, maybe you have 100 virus particles that are on your person and could make it across your biosecurity mitigations. If you're 99% effective, then what you might be able, one single virion might make it through, and that's not enough to infect the bird. On the other hand, if you have 100 billion virus particles in the environment and on the person that might be coming through your Danish entry, and they're 99% effective in eliminating those, you still have 1 billion virus particles that can make it into the farm, and that's certainly enough to infect a flock of birds. So the risk is about the amount of virus that's out there or the amount of bacteria that's out there, and therefore the need for precision and more effective measures at eliminating those virus particles. So I just want to mention here something from the previous slide on showers. You might think about including showers at a time when things are really risky, and they can be very effective, although Dr. Boyer's study shows that they were counterintuitively not as effective. And I think when you do take on showers, they have the potential to really help, but you've got to take a big bite and really make sure you're including scheduling, you're including people to take care of the showers, you make sure that you have enough shower capacity to handle surges in people. So when crews come through, you've got a lot more people coming on to a farm or into a barn than you do during normal times. So all of those things, I think, you have to go and look at your biosecurity system and make sure that you've considered the contingencies that can cause a breakdown, and that's especially true with showers.
Tim, what do you think? What can producers do to enhance biosecurity during high-risk times?
I mean, those are great points. And I think the 14 biosecurity principles are really meant to apply to poultry facilities during routine operations, during peacetime, as you said, and they're aimed at mitigating the common pathways of pathogen introduction onto the farm. And during high-risk times, they would really need to be reevaluated and making sure you're doing what you say you're going to do, and think about maybe additional things that need to be done during high-risk times. Along with those things, there may be heightened measures that are needed that precisely target certain pathways, but that HPAI virus could take to get into your uninfected farm during an outbreak. If HPAI is known to be circulating and you find yourself in an infected zone because you're close to an infected premises, there are other things that you might be required to do in order to obtain a movement permit. For example, there's a measure called the pre-movement isolation period. That's a period of time when there's heightened biosecurity and only critical operations are allowed on the site. During normal times, your plan may have a biosecurity requirement for vaccination crews that they'll wear farm-specific boots and clothes and will properly cross the line of separation. During the pre-movement isolation period, no crews would be allowed to visit the farm for at least 5 days prior to movement. So it's revisiting and reevaluating your existing biosecurity plan and considering things that might need to be done differently during periods of heightened risk. You may want to change cleaning and disinfection procedures for vehicles entering the perimeter buffer area. There's another example.
That's helpful advice, thanks. Let's move on. We've touched on compliance a couple of times, and on the next slide, let's get into that in more detail. The weakest point we know in farm biosecurity is compliance, how well everyone who enters the farm sticks to the rules of the biosecurity plan. And research has shown that people carry out biosecurity measures in the papers that I've seen, and this accounts for poultry premises, like dairy farms, even hospitals, that people carrying out the biosecurity measures generally do it right about half the time, maybe less. So what are the ways that have been shown to be helpful in increasing compliance with biosecurity measures and making sure that everyone on the farm follows the measures every time? Tim, would you like to take that one on?
Well, compliance is tough. Biosecurity can be inconvenient. There is some research that shows that observation, things like the presence of a visible camera at a barn entrance can help improve compliance over the short term, but that compliance still declined over time, even with that measure present. I think it really just comes down to developing a culture within your production system that involves, education, repeated education, revisiting these concepts with your employees because employee turnover is an issue, and gaining employee buy-in. Compliance depends on understanding and describing why these procedures are important and making sure your employees really get that. And then doing things to minimize inconvenience, things like providing choices for footwear and clothing that can emphasize comfort and safety. If you're requiring showering, having clean showers and a nice environment for doing that can help. Getting feedback on what's happening on your operation versus what's written in your biosecurity plan is important. What's actually happening is an anonymous route for gaining feedback needed. And making sure that you're consistent and that everybody's following the same procedures, that your visitors, your contractors, your employees, the grower, the managers, everybody should be doing the same thing to get a culture of biosecurity.
And Carol, would you like to weigh in on that? How can we increase compliance?
Yeah, I agree with Tim. I think I would add, an audit, especially an educational audit where someone can come out and look at your farm and see where the problems might be. This hole in this barn, in this picture is clearly a problem, but my guess is that lots of people have seen this and have walked right past it because they've gotten used to it. And sometimes, someone who is an outsider can provide really good, pointed comments about what you're not seeing anymore. And I think that's always important. And then I would agree, I think the most important reason for a lack of compliance is really that people, call it cognitive dissonance, but seeing the veterinarian come to the farm, this person in authority with knowledge, not entering the barn following the same procedures that workers are asked to follow, or the owner of the farm or anyone else. So every single person who comes to that farm has to follow those same procedures. And one of the better ways to do that is to make sure that someone who's new to the farm is always followed. And, there should be an escort for that person to help them through those biosecurity, those things like line of separation procedures.
Thanks. And next slide, please. Where can producers go to get help in assessing their site-specific risks? Tim, where would you point people to for information on building their plan and trying to encourage people to be compliant with it?
Well, you've got some good suggestions on the slide here. University of Minnesota Extension has a lot of useful videos and other resources to help develop your plan, and the National Poultry Improvement Plan website has detailed information on the 14 biosecurity principles. Also, the Center for Food Safety and Public Health at Iowa State University has a lot of resources, including templates for creating a biosecurity plan. Those things are all focused on the plan and how to create it. But an important step before that is the risk assessment piece. You should spend some time looking and with some local resources, maybe a veterinarian, someone else in your area who has expertise in biosecurity. And like Carol mentioned, have an objective set of eyes looking at your operation and observe and assess it and evaluate the risks. What's the layout of your operation? What are the traffic flows of people and vehicles? What are the things like dead bird disposal? things like that. How are they placed relative to the barns? Who are your closest neighbors? How many other poultry operations are nearby? What are the environmental conditions of your property? Is there open water? Is there forest? What kind of wild birds or other wildlife do you see on your property at different times of the year? Thinking about and assessing those risks and the potential pathways of disease introduction, and having someone look at that with an objective set of eyes with you will go a long way in helping you put those other resources that I mentioned to use to build a good biosecurity plan.
Carol, you and your team have quite a bit of experience in teaching adults. So what resources are available to managers to develop effective training plans? Do you have tips about the best way to train workers to keep up biosecurity measures properly?
Well, it's a very, very tough and very good question. And I think every poultry manager, or really a people manager needs to think about that question. Just as Tim has advocated for taking a look at your site to see what risks are present on your site, your workforce is a specific group of people with a specific set of characteristics that you have to consider when you're training them. And oftentimes I see with training that, we tell somebody something, and then we automatically assume that they're going to absorb that and go do what we've suggested. And that's very, very rarely the case. Adults that go through several steps before they actually will take something on and do the action that they need to do. And that is certainly what we have to get to if biosecurity is going to be effective. So one of the things I think we should always look for is, are there opportunities to make our operational biosecurity structural? Are there ways that we can force people to go through the right door if that's the issue? Are there ways that we can keep people from not crossing the line of separation properly? If there's a side door on the barn that people tend to sneak back into the barn through, maybe you can lock that door or take the handle off the outside or something to keep them from coming in that way. But another thing is, I think you always have to consider what your final step is. Your final step is the action. So you really have to observe that. Are people doing what you've asked? If not, you have to review your program and see where they're breaking down. Talk to them and see if you can get feedback on what has gone wrong. But I will remind you that it's often difficult for Hispanic to get those answers from Hispanic workers who tend to have a great deal of respect or fear of authority. So it takes some relationships and it takes some time to get the answers that you really need. But my advice would be observe and evaluate what you observe.
Thanks so much, Tim and Carol. I really appreciate your wisdom and advice that you provided. I've learned a lot during our sessions together. I'll move on to the next few slides to give you an overview of the resources available through USDA APHIS that will help you prepare for poultry disease outbreaks and make biosecurity an everyday practice. APHIS Veterinary Services has developed a library of checklists. These are based on those 14 NPIP biosecurity principles that we talked about. These provide practical tips and recommendations. We encourage you to visit the Defend the Flock website to view and download these materials. All of the checklists are available in multiple languages, including Spanish, Chinese, Vietnamese, and Tagalog. On our website, you'll find lots of other free tools, including videos, recordings of prior webinars, info cards, newsletters, posters, and other resources. APHIS has also created social media content to help promote biosecurity. Infographics cover many of the best practices. We hope that you will share these with your colleagues and fellow poultry keepers. You can share them on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and other social media channels to make sure everyone is using biosecurity every day, every time. no matter the size of the flock. Earlier this month, APHIS launched an all Spanish language campaign resource page. Now all Spanish resources can be easily found in one place. Users will be able to download Spanish checklists and social graphics and much more. APHIS recently expanded the Defend the Flock biosecurity awareness campaign to include outreach to new and young poultry producers. The hashtag Flock Defender program offers the next generation of poultry keepers with youth-oriented educational poultry care content. This is aimed at increasing awareness and adoption of best practices in biosecurity. Be sure to check out more helpful information on our social media channels. This presentation, along with answers to your questions, it will be available for download from the Defend the Flock website shortly. Be sure to follow Defend the Flock on Facebook and Twitter to be notified when the presentation is available. And before we go, on behalf of APHIS, thank you so much to Tim and Carol for sharing your valuable insights and knowledge with us today. Thanks to all of you for joining us on this webinar. Let's keep our poultry healthy together.